Hey everyone, welcome to the second video of the class. I'm picking up where I left off last time. Now I'm just exporting displacements. I'm also exporting the normal map and the textures that I painted for the body. In the ZBrush multi-map exporter, I'm going to be exporting all the UDIMs all at once. That includes the displacement normal map and the texture polypaint that I painted on the body mesh. I'm exporting a 32-bit EXR for the displacement map with these settings. I'm also checking the smooth UVs button on the displacement on normal map, even though I'm not showing it here. I did that for a later export. Now I'm going through my ZBrush sculpt and the Maya low res to make sure I have meshes combined that are sharing the same UV sheet, the same UDIM. They're occupying the same space, therefore they need to be combined. That is necessary for the 32-bit EXR exporting for the displacement map, because otherwise ZBrush wouldn't be able to combine two different subtools. If they share the same UV space, it doesn't want to combine them if it's 32-bit displacement. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you use a 16-bit TIFF, it should be fine. It should be able to combine separate meshes into the same map, but 32-bit EXRs won't let you combine them into the same exported map. That's why I combine the meshes that share the same UV space. Now I'm using the Renamer app to rename the exported UDIMs while keeping the last 4 digits, which is the UDIM sequence. I'm just giving it a rational name, while also keeping the UDIM file name. I really recommend this Renamer for renaming UDIMs. It goes through a lot of files really fast. Now I'm checking the exported maps, the color, normal map, and displacement map. They look correct. The displacement appears black because it's a 32-bit EXR. Now making a proxy mesh out of the body, bringing all the UV shells into 0 to 1 space, just for a temporary preview, because I'm bringing the body into Substance Painter, but I'm not going to be texturing it there, at least initially. Now I'm making it a decimated low-res version using the reduce feature in Maya. Now I'm going around subdividing my meshes twice. These meshes will be baked in Substance Painter. I'm going to export the curvature AO from them, for example, and these need to be as clean as possible and to match the way they're going to be rendered at the end, which is going to be 2 subdivisions. So I gave each of them 2 subdivisions. That's why I reduced the body. I decimated it down so that my scene becomes lighter, because all the rest of the meshes I'm going to be texturing are actually subdivided and really high. Now in Substance Painter, I check the import UDIM option, and I also bring in my textures. I change the camera focal length to 35 because otherwise it looks super wide. I also enable anti-aliasing and I make the body mesh completely black so it doesn't distract me, because this scene is all about texturing the props and the costume. I go through the texture sets, aka the UDIMs, and now I'm assigning the normal maps that I exported out of ZBrush. These are going to be just for preview. I'm not going to be actually exporting them. I'm going to also be using them to bake the maps from. That only applies to the cloth pieces, which I bake normal maps from ZBrush. Except for the sword, all the metallic objects didn't have a high res, and therefore no ZBrush normal map. Now I'm baking the first 2 maps, the world space and the curvature, using the maximum anti-aliasing settings. I'm not doing the other maps with the aliasing options set to maximum because they take so long or they crash, so I'm going to do that on the second go. I'm later going to bake the ambient occlusion map, the position map, and thickness map with that anti-aliasing option. I'm also going to bake them at 2K. Now I'm inspecting the curvature and the world space map. Everything looks fine, so now I'm going to bake the AO, position, and thickness with anti-aliasing turned off and at 2K resolution, because that's all you need in this case. I only bake the world space map and the curvature map with the highest resolution at 4K and anti-aliasing set to 8x8 because they're going to benefit the most from it, and you can actually see the quality difference, but with the AO and the thickness you don't really see it that much. Now I'm changing the thickness map options so I can avoid some of the issues. Inspecting the maps, all look clean. Enabling the shadow periodically helps you in your texturing. I keep disabling it and enabling it to just textures. Now moving the symmetry plane, which is a new feature in Substance Painter, moving it off the center axis of the world to have symmetry on the sword that's kind of off to the side. Now making a mask for the internal part of the sword, because it's supposed to be darker. I'm doing this symmetrically at the moment, even though the object is off axis, off the world axis. The great thing about Substance Painter is that it's really fast for harsh surface stuff like this one, and it has a lot of really cool grunge maps and a lot of textures that speed things up a lot. And what I love about it is that everything is very connected. Like all the baked maps immediately connect into the smart materials and the smart filters that are already built into the software. Now I'm using some smart materials and grunge maps to start blocking in the sword material. I use a bunch of tileables and a lot of procedural work on this and make sure it doesn't look like it's tiling, so I keep alternating between different grunges to see which one works better. You'll see me toggle some of the channels on and off to check my values, because a lot of times you get distracted and you forget that you're modifying a different map that you don't want to affect, like the metalness, for example. Now I'm adding some directional stretching. I just grabbed one of the grunge maps and I stretched it in one direction. There's a lock icon. If you click, you can adjust the map dimensions independently, so it's not keeping the same aspect ratio. That's one way to get directional scratches. I'm adding some more rust and wear and tear to the sword. I was checking my mask and playing around with the tiling to see what works the best. Now it's time to start actually brushing, and I'm adding some very intentional scratches, making sure it affects the roughness and the height map. I turned off all the weird randomized options on the brush that makes random rotation, random sizing, so that way I can get directional scratches very intentionally. And I'm using the red here to debug to be able to see what I'm actually doing, what this fill layer is affecting. And I'm flooding its mask with the curvature map that I baked earlier. That way I can grab some of that sculptural detail that I had in ZBrush, making it lighter and making it glossier so it looks like it's edge scratching. Now I'm adding some randomization and grunge to the curvature map, so I'm taking away from it, I'm subtracting from it. You see there's blending modes to all the fill layers that I'm adding to the mask. That way I can subtract from the curvature, because you don't want it to just be flooding the entire mesh like that. You don't want it to be intense in every area. Also, never be afraid of going in there with a brush. It doesn't always have to be procedural. A good balance to have is 80% procedural for hard surface and 20% painted. Still adding some more grunges to make it more worn. You notice I'm doing everything through a fill layer so I can adjust it later. You don't want to commit paint to the canvas unless you're really sure of it. So that's why I stay with the fill layers most of the time. It lets you change it after the fact. Everything is painted inside of a mask, or the procedural stuff, even the paint. I'm adding a paint fill to the mask. Now with the paint, I'm able to take away from the curvature map, and I'm also able to add some more worn edges to other areas. If you ever paint anything out from the mask on a paint fill, you can always use the eraser to erase from that paint layer. That way you can get back what the mask had before. You saw me did that earlier when I decided I want those scratches back again. I just used the eraser to remove from the mask, instead of just using black and white. Now some color changes here, playing around with warm and cool colors. Starting with another smart material for the rest of the sword. Never expect those materials to work just directly. It still requires some tweaking. You can always go in there and improve them. You shouldn't just be throwing them on there and just calling it done. It's just a great start. No, I'm adding some bronze in there, so it's not all just completely iron. Now adding some blur to take the edge off of the curvature map so it's not completely sharp. Even at 4K it can sometimes get pixelated. I didn't think doing the sword with UDIM was worth it, so I just kept it like that and just blurred it. Only that one curvature layer though. Now I'm adding some worn details to the bottom of the sword, like it's been used. Always think of the story. Where did this sword come from, how it's been used, and what kind of areas would take more damage than others. See, I was a little bit indecisive about that section right there. I'm trying to figure out which brush would give me the better effect, like it's been scratched. Always experiment with different types of brushes, mixing them together as well. Now I'm adding some manual edge wear, seeing if that would work better than the procedural. I ended up using a mixture of both. Now for the handle, I've decided to make that leather material to kind of be a contrast against the iron and the bronze of the sword. Also makes sense for usability. It's more comfortable to have that kind of grip. It's very functional. I was going off of the black and white reference from the concept artist, so I'm going a little bit off of intuition as well as looking up some reference. Now I'm adding only in the height map stripe shapes that already ship with Substance Painter should be included in there. I'm trying to make it look like it's wrapped leather. I could have sculpted this as well, but I've decided to approach it procedurally so I can change my mind about the design much faster. Now I'm adding different directional wraps, and I'm eventually going to be layering them on top of each other so they look like they're crisscrossed. Now I'm testing out different blending modes to see which one works. I eventually ended up making every stripe its own layer, and then basically making them different values in the height map, so that when you overlay them, some of them are going to be darker than the others, and they're going to look like they're kind of under. Now as you see here, the darker colors are underneath, so they look like they're going under the other wraps that are brighter, because the height map only cares about the color intensity. So I'm playing around with the blending modes, switching them to normal, and making sure that the values are different on each layer. Also blurring stuff around to make it look more sculptural. It's not just completely flat line. Adding some more grunge map and details to the leather. Playing with the width of some of the straps, see what works. Turning on shadows to get a preview of how everything looks. Now for the cloth, I used one of the substance materials that has 2 different color slots for the threads. That way I can tweak them independently and I can get a lot of color variation that way. I played with the tiling to make sure it's correct scale, and also made sure it's rotated the correct direction. Now tweaking some of the colors, I'm also darkening some parts of the fabric to match the concept. Now I'm adding a dirt layer and tweaking the color of it to have some distress to the fabric. Also adding some curvature to it. This fabric I've seen a lot of the outdoors, so it should have some worn edges. Always make sure to tweak the intensity of the curvature though, because sometimes it can just look like it's painted on. Now that I'm happy with the fabric, I instantiate across all the texture sets that have cloth. Instancing is a fairly new feature to Substance, but it's really powerful. You can work on one texture set that has your main cloth piece, and then you can instance that same material folder to all the other texture sets. So when you modify the original, all the others are affected as well. Now I'm using quick materials and really simple textures for the teeth and the tongue. Gums are fairly simple as well. Keeping it simple because it's not going to be seen as much. Adding some roughness variation with some of the grunge maps. Just quick and dirty just to have something in there. I use one of my pre-made tongue materials that I've used in another project. It's just a bunch of cells being multiplied and added to each other. Also blurring some of the cell textures on the height map to make it kind of softer. Now I'm adding some dryness color to the tongue. Adding some tiling cells to the tongue, all in the height map to make it look like it's taste buds. Probably never going to be seeing it that close, but just in case. Checking the values, making sure everything is in the right range. This part of the model should obviously be very glossy. Now it's always good to reuse already existing assets from previous projects. In this case I'm using an eye texture that I've already made before. It was based off of an image I found online of an eye, and then I just tweaked it in Photoshop heavily. It was kind of a stylized look to the eye, so I kept it fairly simple. Here I'm adding it as 2 separate fill layers that then I'm able to move each one independently to match each eye on the UV. Also using the same exact color texture to make some gloss adjustments. Also adding a backdrop fill layer with the roughness value to fill in the gaps. Now I'm adjusting with the levels the roughness, all taken from the color map. Now I'm able to move each eye fill layer independently by moving the pivot point of the manipulator. That way I can rotate it so the detail doesn't look the same. I'm here adding a basic leather material. I'm adding some grunge and edge wear to it. Flooding it with some details to make it look like worn leather. Started with a modified version of one of the bronze materials that come with Substance Painter. Always adjusting the tiling and make sure it fits well with the scale. Also removing some of the edge wear so it doesn't look too intense and uniform everywhere. This is really important for avoiding the Substance Painter look where it looks just like uniform curvature everywhere. So I'm taking some of that off. Adding a different color tint to the metal. Switching the material fill layer to triplanar projection so I don't get any seams. The triplanar projection is really important and really powerful for avoiding all seams. Switch everything into the triplanar projection mode. That's for fill layers, or any texture that's filling the object should be in triplanar. That way it covers all UV seams automatically. Now I'm instancing all the metal textures to all the appropriate UDIMs. Reusing some of the materials when possible, for example the leather. Adjusting some of the roughness values to make sure they fit well with the other metals in the scene. Always important to check the roughness values periodically. A lot of times they end up looking correct in the Substance Painter viewport, but then not correct in the renderer. Now adding some color variation to the rings because they were looking too even. I'm also able to conveniently paint in the UV space to add a stripe of color. Making the bracelets a little bit darker because they were standing out too much. Always step back to look at the whole model together. Adjusting some of the scratches to make sure they're not too small. Also using triplanar projection here again, making sure all the fill layers have the option set. This avoids seams. Adjusting the grunge scale and the offset to get the right look I'm after. Making the earrings bronze so everything doesn't have the same type of metal in that area. Checking the Metalness map is also really important because sometimes you get a stray layer like this one that's contributing to the metalness. In this case, I didn't want the area to be non-metallic. I actually wanted it to be reflective. I didn't want it to look like dust. I wanted it to look like worn metal. Now I'm removing this spot here that was kind of annoying. It was kind of distracting, so I'm taking that out. Now this is a nice little trick to get a curvature map out of height map that you already painted inside of Substance. And you don't want to export it and bring it back in again to bake a curvature map out of it. In this case, I had 3 patterns contributing to the height map on 3 different layers. So I added 1 anchor point to each, and then I filled those anchor points in another layer, that's the red one. And now I'm able to actually grab the information and then add a high pass filter to it. Then I'm able to use the levels on that high pass filter to grab the curvature information. It basically grabs the edges of the height map. Now I'm adjusting the UV rotation to make sure I don't get seam at the bottom of the handle. Changing the color of the headrest jewelry to be more bronze. Now improving the quality of the worn edges on the hat. Now this gemstone was an interesting experiment. I started with a metal shader, and then I added a bunch of triangles, kind of patterns, and then overlaid them together, blurred them, used a bunch of high pass filters and levels to kind of make it look like it's shards. Eventually in V-Ray during the look dev I'll be using Refraction, but this is going to be the detail map I use on this piece. I'm going to use it to make the refraction look like it has details, like the piece has depth. So what I ended up doing was using these triangles here and then multiplying other triangles and adding different patterns on top of them. You see here I'm mixing them together to kind of get some variation so it doesn't look too uniform. The blending modes are really powerful for this. This is kind of like Substance Designer workflow, but I'm using it inside of Substance Painter. Mixing different patterns is really powerful. We'll be testing this next week with Refraction in LookDev. Now it's time to export those textures for V-Ray. There's a lot of presets for different renderers, but I'm using the V-Ray UDIM, a modified version of it. I'm basically just changing the names on it to make sure it exports with the UDIM file name at the end. Now I'm going to the texture sets that have a normal map that came from ZBrush, and I'm Xing that. I'm removing it out of the texture set. The ZBrush normal map was temporary for the cloth, and I'm going to be rendering that with the displacement map in V-Ray. So what I'm exporting now is just the normal map that I painted without the ZBrush normal map. I removed the ZBrush normal map. Now I'm exporting a UV snapshot for the face. It's only the first UDIM tile. We're going to be using the Texturing XYZ pack. It's a full face texture and displacement and spec map on gloss map. I bring them into the same document, I drag them all in, and I make sure they're all converted to a smart object, and then I use a puppet warp to basically fit it into the UV space. This is an initial rough fit, but then I'm going to jump into the liquify to actually have more accurate control. I'm doing this to the color map, but I'm transferring it to the other maps as well after the fact. I'm going to utilize the smart object filters to be able to transfer what I did to one layer to the others. So now I'm in liquify, also on that same layer. Now I'm tweaking the display options to see what I'm doing better. I'm masking the bottom lip so it can affect the top lip without affecting the bottom lip. Now do the opposite as well. Try to fit each lip to the wireframe as much as possible. Then shaping the nostril to fit the wireframe as much as possible as well. Same logic of masking applies to the eyes. I fit it to the wireframe using masking. These full face textures from Texturing XYZ are super helpful for starting. Now after I get out of the liquify filter, I drag all the smart filters that I've done to the first layer onto the other layers, which are also smart objects. This copies all the deformation, and now I save every individual layer to its own TIFF file, making sure I check the Save Transparency option. This makes sure the TIFF file has alpha. I will be taking those into Mari and using them as my base. Taking those textures into Mari just to show you how I'm using it, but it can also be done in Substance Painter. Now in Mari I load in the mesh and then set the category to V-Ray Material VFX, because that's my renderer. It's going to set up the channels for me. Also changing the reflection type to GGX instead of Blend. Now I import the ZBrush color maps that I exported under the Sequence tab as a UDIM. If you ever encounter any visual artifacts or color banding, go to the settings under the GPU tabs, under virtual textures, and switch the type from byte to half. That usually solves it. Time to import the Texturing XYZ UDIM that I've done in Photoshop earlier. Under the named files tab, I import that as only one UDIM. I also make sure to bring it in with the Keep Transparency option enabled so it doesn't come out with a black border as you saw. Now do the same thing for the other channels. The bump map, which is going to be our displacement. Also, I bring in the normal map that was exported from ZBrush. This is just a temporary preview. I'm never going to render it. I do this under the Sequence tab. Now it brings in all the exported ZBrush normal maps. I remove the channel connections from the shader for the gloss. Then I tweak the shader value so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. And now I can judge the normal map. It looks incorrect, so I'm going to add a invert for only the green channel. And now it corrects it. Later on, I'll plug back the gloss channel and the spec channel into the shader. But for now, I'm just doing the environment lighting, and then I'm hiding the background. Then I turn on one light from the front, and then I set it to follow the camera. Now it's time to do some color correction to the first UDIM, the Texturing XYZ map. I level it and grade it to make it fit the rest of the body color as much as possible. I end up tweaking both of them so they kind of meet in the middle, but I start with this one. One great thing about Mari is that I can add additional meshes at any time. So I'm just adding the props. I also decimated them and made them super low res. I bring them in and add a dark color to them just so they can fill in the spaces and show me the context. I already textured those in Substance Painter. Now we continue to grade the color and refine it. I use an HSV adjustment on the body to bring it closer to the face texture. Also vice versa by bringing the face texture closer to the body. Now I go ahead and start masking out some of the unwanted details from the Texturing XYZ color map. Now I hide the rest of the body mesh so I can isolate the head UDIM. This makes the paint baking much faster. Continue to remove some of that detail and then bake it down. I could have also done this in Substance Painter as well. Later on you'll see I'll switch back to Substance to continue working on some of these maps. But I'm just showing you my workflow in Mari when I need to use it. I then decide to switch to a softer brush to get more softer edge. The ears will be hidden, but I'm still cleaning them up. I would spend much more time on this area usually, but it's going to be hidden, so I'm not going to take too much time on it. Now I'm fixing the nostril area. I'm filling it with a more darker color. Then I'm blending it back to the face. Removing some unwanted details from the original map on the corner of the eyes. I I switched from masking out to actually using a paint layer with real paint to do some blending. Great thing about new Mari 4 is that you can actually have symmetry now, so it enables symmetry, analyzes the mesh, and it gives you a symmetry line down the middle. They call it mirror projection in Mari. Now I'm able to update the eyelashes and painting them much darker. I'm going to be using XGen for hair and eyelashes in the following weeks, but I'm also painting it in the texture to make it look like mascara. I'm painting it with a mask in a procedural fill color layer. Now I'm painting the inside of the mouth, also known as the mouth bag, to make it darker. Now I get rid of the internal seam inside, just for cleanliness. Now I'm showing you the different channels of the displacement maps that came with texturing XYZ. They have different details in every channel. The R and G and B contain different details. The secondary, tertiary, and micro. We're going to be plugging these into V-Ray as separate channels, and we can tweak them individually. We also have this utility map that came with the texturing XYZ pack. Two of those channels could be used as gloss and specular maps, so I'm only using those two. Gloss controls how tight the reflection is, and the specular map controls the color of the reflection and how intense it is. You see I'm starting to set that up here with the reflection amount channel. Now I'm copying some of the stuff I already did on the diffuse color channel, and I'm reusing it here so I don't have to paint all the stuff again. Now I'm tweaking the colors since it was a procedural color layer. Most of my painting was done on the mask, so I can salvage that. Same setup on the gloss map, reusing the already painted layers and tweaking their value to fit in with the rest of the texture. Copying more layers from the diffuse color channel and also tweaking them again, as you see the eyelids and the rest of the blending. That one I have to desaturate. You can use the saturate adjustment or the luminosity adjustment, which I've used here. I've plugged in the gloss and specular channels into the V-Ray shader. Now I go ahead and level each separately so I can get the correct values and don't waste any of the information. Now with the new export manager, I export everything except for the temporary normal map. I ended up exporting the maps as .tiff file format, all in the linear color space. Now bring them into Substance Painter to continue working on them. Some stuff are much faster to do inside of Substance Painter as opposed to Mari. Although loading in the files is really annoying, as you can see here I have to bring in one file at a time. Substance doesn't import the UDIM sequence. Next I set up all my maps, like the spec, the gloss. Temporarily I put a dark fill layer at the bottom of the layer stack, so I can judge the specular and gloss levels against it. It's easier to see that way. I adjust the gloss and the specular level using a levels adjustment. I know the maps look correct when I start seeing the lips looking more glossier than the rest, for example. I import a tiling skin texture that I got from Surface Mimic. I use that for coverage for the rest of the body. It seems to have a very noticeable tiling effect, so I just replace it with another one. This one works much better. It could still be improved though, so I'll address that later on when I start mixing it with different tiling textures. I'm allowing it to affect multiple channels at the same time, the color, specular, and gloss. This is incredibly fast in Substance Painter versus Mari. I can't paint across the UDIM seams here like I can do in Mari, but I can at least have much faster interactivity. Also, a great thing about using UDIMs is that I can reach much higher quality in here by having 4K for different sections of the body. So the greatest benefit is now being able to have a lot of details in the tiling texture that covers the entire body. Now I start mixing different tileable textures together to get kind of a skin look. This will bridge the face to the rest of the body and hopefully look like a seamless texture. It's not going to look as good as a scan that comes out of texturing XYZ, but since the face is the focal point, usually the realistic details go there, and then you can get away with a lot, especially for a style like that, if you just use a lot of tileable and procedural stuff to cover the body. Although for a more realistic character, I will actually use scans as much as possible, even for the body, and I will use a lot of de-lit photo references and then project on the body, but not in this case. Now I'm using a mask to fade the face back into the body to kind of merge them together. Also fixing some seams here and making sure that my channels are correct and I'm not affecting other channels that I don't intend to. Always have to be careful which channel the paint is going in. Also, it's worth mentioning that this is a spec gloss workflow and I'm not using the roughness and metalness in this project. This can be set up when you're starting out in Substance Painter, when you're setting up a new project. You can choose the spec gloss workflow. This one way of doing it, earlier when we were doing the props, we worked with the metalness roughness workflow and then we converted it on export. But in this case, for the skin texturing, I've decided I'm just gonna use the spec and the gloss from the get-go. There's different ways to set up the project. Both are valid. As long as you end up with an exported gloss and specular, also known as reflection map, you should be good. It doesn't matter what the input was, as long as the output is correct. Now I'm improving some of the blending and the color. Now I need to have what I did in the face to be propagated to the rest of the body. So I'm going to use the Instantiate across texture sets and then I select the relevant texture sets. Now one thing to note here is that if you're using a lot of anchor points like I'm doing here to reuse some data from one layer onto the other, that it would not work very well with the Instantiate, the instance feature. So what I do to solve this is I drag all these layers into one folder and then I instant that folder. So that folder gets sent, so whatever happens inside of it travels with it across the instances, including the anchor points. Now I'm going to be making sure to do that with the other channels as well. The gloss and the specular. Also, I start going to those texture sets and organizing the order to make sure everything is stacked correctly. All the blending modes are set to path through. Now that I have coverage on the body in all the channels, I can now add some color variation that's been missing. So I start by defining the zones of the face. It usually starts with blue or green, and then it fades into red in the middle and then ends with yellow at the top of the forehead. This is generally the case, but it could change between different characters. After I painted that very intensely, I dropped the opacity of it and now I'm tweaking it. And then I blur it. I'm going around the body and making sure all the values are correct. I'm noticing some of the joints have much darker colors. I think that was when I painted it in ZBrush, but now I can see it much better here inside of Substance with the correct color profile. Now I'm going to use the PBR spec gloss preset that already exists inside of Substance, but I'm going to duplicate it and then make it a custom where I'm changing the names and making sure the texture set name, which is the UDIM name, is the last part of the file name, so it loads correctly into Maya inside of V-Ray. Also making sure the spec map is named the reflection map to match the already exported maps from the previous projects when I was doing the props and the costume. Now I have all the exports, they look correct. Except for that one actually could be improved, so I'm going back to tweak the blending on the edges of the face. I adjust the color a little bit and the value to make it fit better. I don't blend it in too perfectly, but ideally it should be the case, especially for characters where the head is exposed. Now it's worth noting that the texturing XYZ maps are 16-bit color, so they're RGB, and the height map inside of Substance is actually grayscale, so now I'm switching it to RGB and now you see the color difference, how big of an impact that makes. And you can start seeing the other forms, like the secondary map for example, is more accentuated. So now I'm making my own custom export preset, I'm calling it displacement 16-bit. And then I'm making sure it's a TIFF in 16-bit. And then I'm making a separate channel called user 0 and I'm changing the name of it to displacement, DISP. And then I'm making sure I'm filling it with the same exact information that I've used in the height map. So now the height channel and the displacement channel contain the same information. And I'm making sure to add it manually in all the texture sets. This is very manual to do after the fact, after you've set the project, but sometimes it's necessary. Now I'm going to go around and make sure every one of those displacement channels is set to RGB 16F, which is 16-bit. And then I'm going to change the preset to that displacement 16-bit. Now with the height map matching this displacement map, I'm going to export and I'm going to end up with a color map that has the different channels. And as you can see, it has the secondary, tertiary, and micro detail in its channels. You wouldn't be able to do this with just exporting the height map. Now I'm fixing some of the errors here. So now I bring all these maps into Maya just for a quick preview. I'm just loading in the color maps and hitting generate preview to display the color. So we're going to be doing look dev on this next time, doing all the shading in V-Ray. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching.